Awesome. Hey everyone, I hope you're doing well today. My name is Sam. My pronouns are they, them, and theirs, and I am the Member Experience Manager at Advent Co-working. Today for our Advent member talk, we are joined by Kristie Puckett Williams. She is going to be going over the history of policing and what calls to defund the police mean and look like. So I'm really excited to hand this over to her. If you have any questions throughout the talk, if you're watching on Zoom, feel free to add it to the Q&A. And if you're watching on Facebook, just comment it and we'll have a short Q&A at the end. So I will hand it over to you, Kristie.
Thank you, Sam. And thank you to Advent for allowing me to present this information. I think it's really important that people, as they move throughout their day and they hear and watch the news and they hear the calls to defund the police, that they understand where those calls come from, where they stem from, and what they mean. And so I have a lot of information to go through really quickly, but I am going to share this slide deck with you all. And we'll get right through it. So I am, again, Kristie Puckett Williams. I work for the American Civil Liberties Union of North Carolina. I manage the Campaign for Smart Justice. And our campaign goals are to reduce mass incarceration in the state by half and to challenge the racism that we know exists in the criminal legal system. And so, as I stated, we're going to go through the history of police in America and what does it mean to defund the police. So in the 1100s, there began a practice of having a shire reeve, or what we call today a sheriff in England. And sheriffs were representatives of the crown who sat in on local affairs to make sure that laws were being enforced, because before that, the community relied on itself to enforce the laws upon each other. The sheriff's role extended the power of the crown out into the community. And they were unpopular because they were tax collectors, at least initially. And then later forms of the sheriff included coroner, justice of the peace, and constable. And then in the late 1100s to the 1800s, the use of night watches expanded in Europe and in its colonies. And night watches were simply civilian groups of men required by law to patrol the streets at night. They were unpaid, often unwilling, and apparently they were drunk a lot at night. So we all learned the song when we were little, and 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. And that sparked the colonization of the Americas by Europeans. And that colonization included using brutal militia force as a routine part of land grabbing, along with forcing indigenous people into working for those colonizers in mines and in agriculture. And so in the 1500s to 1800s, those colonial forces imported European justice systems into what is now the United States. And those things included sheriffs, constables, night watches. Again, over here, they were just as unpopular as they were in Europe because, again, those jobs included taxes and working elections alongside enforcing the law. In the 1700s, we saw the establishment of the Transatlantic slave trade here in the United States. And the use of force and control of Black bodies became institutionalized into our economic system here in America. In the 1680, just to demonstrate that, South Carolina passed a law that allowed any white person to capture and punish a runaway slave. In 1690, a law was passed that required white people to act in this role. So the law in 1680 allowed it. In 1690, it required it. So slavery and white supremacy were so fully institutionalized in the American South. One author put it, white supremacy served in lieu of a police force. In 1703, Boston passed a curfew for all Black and indigenous people, which thereby established race as a defining criteria in law enforcement in the new colonies, even in those colonies where they did not have slaves. Race was still a defining criteria in who law was enforced upon. So in the 1700s, various southern cities like Charleston, Savannah, New Orleans, and Mobile, they form paramilitary groups that are solely tasked with control of enslaved people. The goal was to prevent and suppress rebellions from occurring. Slave patrols and militias often worked together during that time. In the United States, these organized patrols are the first antecedents to modern police forces. So these are the ancestors of what we know as police today would be these slave patrols and militias. In the early 1800s, laws were passed in several southern states that required all Black people to carry passes and allowed for the arrest of any Black person that did not have a pass, regardless of their status. So if they were free or not, Black people were required to have a pass that showed that they were allowed to move about. In the mid-1800s, police in the United States coalesced into one relatively uniform type of law enforcement. Previous law enforcement models, such as the guards and the watchmen and the militias and the slave controls, consolidate into city-run 24-hour police in the mid-1800s. 1845 came the establishment of a first unified and uniform police force in New York City. Boston and Philadelphia follow. And we know in 1865, emancipation occurred, but that is immediately followed by the passage of laws that control Black people's public movement and their work. Emancipation also stipulated that slave labor could continue for those convicted of a crime, which created an incentive for white people that were empowered to arrest Black people in order to exploit their labor and prevent their entry into wage labor and political power. And that's through the 13th Amendment. In the 1860s and 70s, Reconstruction and a rapid gain of political powers by Black people in the South is met with extreme legal and extra-legal backlash, including violent vigilante and militia action against Black people attempting to vote or run for office. Southern law enforcement was often indistinguishable from white supremacy vigilante groups. So it was hard to tell who was the white supremacist vigilante group and who was law enforcement in the 1860s and 70s. In the late 1800s, the increased urbanization and industrialization of this country led to a decrease in serious crime. But we saw an increase in the fears of elite class because they feared a working class rebellion. So writer Christian Williams says, the crisis of the time was not one of law, but of order. Specifically, the order required by the new industrial economy and the Protestant moralism that's applied in large part its ideological expression. So it wasn't about law in the late 1800s, it was more so about order, ensuring that people were going to work in these mills and in these factories and plants. In 1905, the Pennsylvania State Police became the first state police agency that was established, and it was established specifically in response to private police forces that were used by mine and mill owners to stop worker strikes and the inability or refusal of the local police to enforce the law. By the 1930s, every state had some form of a police agency, of a state police agency. So the formation of state police forces begins, as I stated, a response to union actions. Large corporations had employed their own private forces, and reformists saw this as unsavory, while corporations also saw it as expensive. So state troopers became the solution to workers uniting. So in the 1930s, we all know of J. Edgar Hoover and the U.S. Bureau of Investigation, which changed its name to the FBI. They expanded to their crime fighting responsibilities and began to train local police officers. In 1943, this country experienced the Detroit riots. There were arrests of Black people after some type of altercation and a rape accusation, and it led to days of white folks rioting against Black people and Black people rioting back against the white people. And according to Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, the police used persuasion rather than firm action with white rioters, while against Negroes, they used the ultimate in force: nightsticks, revolvers, riot guns, submachine guns, and deer guns. In 1942 and 1946, during the World War II, this country incarcerated between 110 and 120,000 people of Japanese descent, the majority of whom were American citizens. They were forced out of their homes and imprisoned in camps, internment camps. And they were there signed into there by President Roosevelt after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor. This was a collaboration between the executive branch, the presidency, the military, the Census Bureau, and local police to place these people, take them out of their homes and place them in internment camps. In the 1940s and 50s, we saw the Red Scare and McCarthyism. Anyone who was a suspected communist was surveilled and blacklisted. And that McCarthyism is a precursor to the anti-terrorism policies that we see today, that we use to justify the surveillance of people. In 1950, schools began creating their own security forces to crack down on property destruction and vandalism. In the 1950s, we saw the civil rights movement emerge. Non-violent protesters, most of them Black, are routinely met with violence by the police. They were engaging in acts of civil disobedience strategically in the national campaign for the civil rights. After decades of quashed attempts, the police themselves in the 60s and 70s are finally able to form their own unions. States' concessions to police create further inequity up and down the police hierarchy. In 1961, the Freedom Riders are met with police violence in Alabama, where the riders are arrested and removed from the bus. When they returned on Mother's Day of that year, of 1961, they were beaten by Klansmen while police looked away. In 1964 through 1967, we saw uprisings across this country, New York City, LA, Detroit, and Newark, in response to police brutality against the Black community. Bloody Sunday happened on March 7, 1965, on the march from Selma to Montgomery. In 1966 and 1969, we saw our queer family resist police harassment at Compton's cafeteria and through the Stonewall rebellions. 1968, the first SWAT team was established in Los Angeles. And in 1968, also, police repression of the DNC in Chicago, many people were injured and killed. And this moment is actually very important in when we talk about police mob violence, because it was captured on camera and it was distributed internationally. And it forced the Chicago police to admit that things had gotten out of control. In 1969, Fred Hampton was murdered in Chicago. The FBI worked with the Chicago police to commit premeditated murder of Black Panther Party leader Fred Hampton in his house on the South Side. In the 1970s and 80s, through federally funded drug war programs and surplus equipment from the military, paramilitary police units, SWAT teams, and anti-drug task forces began to spring up. In 1972, the Chicago police torture began. Under the leadership of Police Commander John Burge, at least 135 Black people are tortured by Chicago police between 1972 and 1991. By the time the issue was brought to the surface, the statute of limitations is up for a torture trial. In the 1980s, the drug war begins during the Reagan administration that urged and set up urban communities of color as both victims and perpetrators in an ongoing process of criminalization. Crack cocaine shows up in these communities while the feds look away. Many police raids happen, especially in South Central LA during the 80s. In the 90s, we see municipal school districts begin establishing their own law enforcement agencies in response to an increase in school shootings. In the 1990s, we also see passage of lots of problematic legislation, such as the zero tolerance, racial profiling, laws like Proposition 21, Three Strikes Law, all these things that further entrench and promote the growth of the prison industrial complex in this country. In 1992, we see that Rodney King is not only beaten by the police, but there are uprisings across this country, especially in Los Angeles, and in response to that. In the 1990s, community policing model emerges around the country, which encourages homeowners, business owners, and local police to unify efforts to police the streets. This process is closely tied with urban gentrification, and in practice, certain populations generally get counted among the problems to be solved rather than the community to be involved. In 2001, 9/11 changes the face of policing and surveillance. The US Patriot Act expands the federal government's authority, especially around surveillance. Homeland Security Grants program funnels more money to local police departments. terror enhancements are used to trump up charges. In 2010, John Burge, who oversaw the program that tortured 135 Black people in Chicago, was convicted for lying under oath about the police torture. And in March 2011, Secure Communities, which is a program of Homeland Security that uses partnerships among federal, state, and local law enforcement agencies, lets them share databases to more effectively deport immigrants by giving ICE access to fingerprints taken at local jails. And that expands to over 1,200 jurisdictions in 2011. The most recent history of policing is a wall of names of people who have been killed by the police. A disproportionate amount of them are Black, brown, queer, disabled, substance using, have mental health issues. Because we have seen how the police have been using brute force to silence, surveil, and control, there have been calls to defund the police. What exactly does that mean, and what does it look like? And I just want to take a brief moment to say that this timeline is missing some parts because it is impossible in 30 minutes to go through every single significant moment in policing. So when you hear calls for defund the police, we're talking about several things. One, it is a demand for transparency in law enforcement budgets. And two, it is a call for reallocation of money currently spent on policing to investments and initiatives and programs that are proven to make our communities safer, such as quality, affordable, and accessible housing, quality, universal health care that includes community-based health, mental health services and supports, income support, living wages, education, and programs for our youth. We won't just focus on the size of police departments' budgets. We'll also focus on reducing the power, the scope, and the size of police departments. We want to continue to delegitimize police as agents of service and safety, and instead put the focus on their power, control, and surveillance, because that is what they have used to harm the community, as you've seen through the history of policing for many, many years. So what does it look like? Defunding police looks like preventing police departments and Department of Homeland Security budget funding increases, substantially reducing the budgets with commitments to not vote for increased funding in the future, make further cuts in the future, and immediately invest in education, healthcare, housing, jobs, youth programs, child care, income support, public transportation, and community-based violence prevention and response programs. It looks like cutting police overtime budgets, cutting police public relations and legal defense funds, increase police department budget transparency, creating a participatory budgeting process that allows communities to designate funding to public and community-based public safety infrastructure and programs that reside outside of law enforcement. So we could still have 911, but instead of it just being police, fire, and medic, there would be other options that people could tap into. We could open our police contract negotiations to public scrutiny, participation, and approval. We can decriminalize public order and survival-based offenses and repeal law enforcement Bill of Rights. And I know you might be saying, well, Kristie, what is the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights? It was intended to protect our police officers from investigation and prosecution arising from conduct during official performance of their duties, and provides them with privileges based on due process additional to those normally provided to other residents or citizens of this country. 16 states have versions of this bill written into their statutes, and many other states have similar provisions written into their contracts with police unions. Critics of this Bill of Rights say that it makes it impossible to discipline or remove bad officers, including but not limited to after they have been convicted of felonies in the courts. Under the Law Enforcement Officers Bill of Rights, officers are judged only by other officers. It also prevents the formation of civilian review boards that give civilians oversight over police actions. Thank y'all so much. That is the end of the presentation. I'm ready to take questions. I just wanted to remind you all that this presentation is adapted from the policing timeline that was created by Critical Resistance. We appreciate them for their tireless work of creating community learning resources.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristie, for condensing so much information into, yes, a very short amount of time. And it's a much larger conversation. And there is a slight delay to Facebook. So just folks watching on Facebook, if you have any questions, go ahead and comment those. But one question for you, Kristie, just to kind of start this off. Throughout history, we always see the oppressors. So, people in power are constantly changing the way that our oppression looks like. And, we see this within policing and, throughout history. And so we always have calls for reform, and then, it changes, and then we kind of become like cool again. And then I'm not being very clear with this question. What do you think? What do you think about folks' call to reform versus to abolish the police?
Sure. So when we say reform, we're just taking what already is and rearranging it, is what I look at it as, right? We're reforming it. We need transformational change. We need something that doesn't look like what we currently have. And that's why abolishment, when we talk about abolishing the police, we're not talking about abolishing safety or order, but we are talking about abolishing the brutality, the power differential, and the disconnection of people's humanity through the use of law enforcement. The white supremacy and anti-Blackness continue to show up in the way laws are administered, to who they're administered to, who gets affected the most. And so until we have an equitable way of ensuring that people are being held accountable, then we need as much transparency as possible. And what we've seen in the history of policing, they've been very, very, very resistant to the transparency and accountability that we're asking for. And so since they can't be transparent or accountable, then we need to just abolish them, because I can't see that reforming is going to make them more transparent or accountable. They've been resistant to that at every turn. Their unions are powerful, and they protect them and their best interests, not necessarily that of the people.
Absolutely. Another question is, how do you counter critics that point to extreme violent crimes as reasons why police are necessary?
Well, because the police don't prevent those violent crimes from happening. The police show up once those crimes have already occurred. And so how do we really disrupt that violence? Is we've seen it's not through the police, because again, they're showing up once the violence has occurred. And when we talk about violent crimes, most people are harming people who are proximate to them. So it's neighbor on neighbor crime. It's not black on black. It's not white on white. It's people kill who they're proximate to. Now, are Black people living next to each other? Yes, due to segregation, gentrification, and all the ways in which Black people are placed into boxes, then yes, their neighbors do kill neighbors. But if we look at poverty, which is more violent than any individual has ever been to another individual, then we can understand why people act in these ways. And if we begin to mitigate some of those factors that drive the violence, such as incarceration, which drives violence, and reconnect people to livable wage jobs, quality of health care, quality, affordable, accessible housing, those things are the things that actually decrease crime in the community and not increase and perpetuate crime. And when we talk about violent crime, we're talking about less than 5% of the people who are currently incarcerated in this country. So 95% of the people are not engaging in those behaviors. If we spent our resources figuring out what's wrong or what's going on with those 5%, maybe we would have better answers and be able to get down to zero. But because we're having this large dragnet of non-violent people who aren't engaged in violent crime, all of these people are being incarcerated and disconnected from their humanity and their family. And that is what drives the overall violence that we see. People having the stigma of criminal records is violent. You know what I mean? Not saying that people don't need to be held accountable for what they've done, but how long are people supposed to be punished and placed into second-class citizenship for something that they've done? I know I've done things 20 years ago that I'm not proud of today, right? I am a habitual felon. I am not proud of all of the things that I've engaged in, but does that still define who I am today? I say no. So I believe that we do have to hold people accountable, but it doesn't have to be through the system of incarceration. We really want people to get to healing and healthy and whole. And just because someone committed a heinous act today doesn't mean that they're forever doomed to react in that way, right? People do change, people get better, and they get better when we invest in them, not bet against them.
Absolutely. I completely agree with you. And you mentioned in there, some of those like survival-based crimes that, folks take part in. And someone did ask, what are some examples of those? So I was wondering if you could just kind of flesh those out a little bit.
Anytime you see defecating in public, we have people in our community, in our homeless neighbors community, who have been charged over 40 times with defecating in public. So if someone does not have a home, where are they going to use the bathroom but in public? Trespassing. is another survival crime. When someone is sleeping in a doorway, they are often charged with trespassing. I would say lots of times stealing, especially when people are stealing from stores, places of business. You see it as, oh, they just don't want to pay for things. A lot of the time, they're too poor to afford it, or they have an underlying mental health or drug addiction that is driving their needs to burn that money up. As someone who is a recovering addict, I stole from plenty of stores as a result of that addiction. Have not stole since I recovered from the addiction. See how that kind of clears itself up? Yeah. So all these things that people engage in, these behaviors, there are reasons. We have to get to the root and stop looking at the behavior and incarceration as a solution to that behavior. We have to really get to what is the root of that behavior, what drives that behavior. And once we have that nuanced analysis of what's driving that person's behavior, and we try to address those needs, we see their risk go down significantly.
Absolutely. You know, if everyone had housing and food and education and care, we wouldn't see all of these things happen.
They'd be
Absolutely.
too busy living their life,
Right.
a
Finding
good
real
life.
love.
Finding,
Exactly.
you would be able to go whitewater rafting. All the things that we've defined, especially as Black people, that we say that's white people stuff. It's not so much that, it's people who've had access, people who have the leisure to enjoy recreation. But when you're so busy being Black and trying to survive the brutality of the police and the brutality of poverty every day, it's kind of hard to go out and kayak and enjoy and inhale the fresh mountain air when you might not make it to the mountains because you got pulled over on an illegal stop because you were racially profiled and then shot down on the side of the road. You see what I'm saying? So like all of the things that people take for granted or that they think, oh, look at those people behaving in that way. I can promise you there's an explanation for that behavior if you're willing to get proximate and look close enough.
Absolutely. Yeah, and last question as we're getting to the end of our very
Yeah.
short time. Is there another city or country that has successfully defunded the police system, which could provide some concrete examples for action and how to move forward here in Charlotte?
Sure. So we've seen here in this country, there are places who have decided just recently to defund the police, and they're figuring out what that looks like. There are countries that I don't think they've named it so much defund the police, but like Portugal has decriminalized drug use, right? And what they've seen is a substantial reduction in the amount of people who use drugs, the people who seek treatment, and their murders as a result because of the decriminalization of drugs. And the average time that a person spends in prison in Portugal for a murder is 7 years as opposed to life here, right? And so, and their recidivism rate is zero. So in those 7 years, they're not being continuously dehumanized, demoralized, tortured, placed in a, you know what I mean? They're actively working with them to make better decisions, to understand what happened. And so it's not so much as a they may not have so much defunded the police as in taking money from the police, but they have changed their response, the response that the police have. And so we can defund the police looks a whole lot of different ways. I think it's not going to look the same way everywhere. Each community needs to have its own assessment of what its community needs because each community is different. There are rural places, there's suburban places, there's urban places, there are places that are, skew more white, skew more Black. We need to have these nuanced assessments of what needs are of a community and stop trying to like take cookie cutter and make community fit inside of these formulas that we have that work. Well, they worked over here, so they'll work over here. We have plenty of money here in Charlotte. What we don't have is the will and the unity to create these changes that we would like to see. And we have to get our egos out of the way. We don't all know everything. We are all teachers. We're all learners. We all have the opportunity to really reimagine what does safety look like and what is violent, how we respond to that in our community. To try to attempt to be the New South, the city of the New South, the Queen City that reigns above all others.
Thank you. That was really great. If folks want, yeah, if folks want to either maybe look at that slideshow again, get in touch with you, learn more, where are some places they can do that?
So you can follow me on Twitter or Instagram. It's at Kristie, Kristie _1979. I'm also on Facebook, Kristie Puckett Williams. I can send, if people want this slide deck, they can hit me up and I'll make it available.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kristie. And thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Advent Member Talks is a weekly event that gives our members the opportunity to share their skills and experiences and so much knowledge, not only with fellow members, but with the greater Charlotte community. You can find this talk here with Kristie as well as our previous talks on our YouTube channel, Advent Co-working Videos. And I hope you'll join us next Tuesday at 4:30. And thank you again so much. I hope you all have a great evening.